This week on Cultural Bazooka News, conflicts around the world. First, we start off with Jackson Franchville in Colombia.
A civil war that has lasted decades in Colombia is now beginning to subside as a number of threats and attacks decrease and plans for peace arise. For the past 50 years, two guerrilla groups by the names of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, otherwise known as FARC, and the National Liberation Army, otherwise known as ELN, have caused great instability within the nation. These two groups have been focused on overthrowing the current government of Colombia and instituting a communist model, and consist mainly of college students and Catholic clergy. Their inspiration came from the Cuban Revolution and Marxist ideology, as well as a previous war in Colombia between conservatives and liberals called La Violencia. Originally, these guerrilla groups relied on kidnapping and oil drilling to gain revenue, but in the past years have turned to drug trade for money. I recently had the opportunity to interview a drug lord. Here's an inside look of the life of a drug lord. I am here with Sergio. He is a well-known drug dealer here in Colombia. For his privacy, he asked that we only say his first name and allow him to cover up his face. So, Sergio, how long have you been in the business?
I have been drug dealer since I was a little boy. I started off growing the coca when I was 7 years old. As I got older, I was given more responsibility and have gotten to where I am now.
Have you been affected by any of the left-wing guerrilla groups?
Me and my workers were controlled by the FARC for a while. They take money and products from us. We have no defense against these groups.
Now that the left-wing guerrillas have declined in numbers, are they still using the drug trade?
They have been away from us for around those years. Now we have mucho lucky that they don't have a lot of power and support. We can now conduct our business as usual. Would you care for some cocaine to take home to the United States of America?
Thank you for allowing us to interview you.
I have plenty of cocaine with me. I will go get it. Hey, necesito la cocaína. Este hombre la quiero.
We, of course, did not take any cocaine with us. Over 5 million people have been displaced and more than 200,000 have died, making Colombia the third most dangerous nation in the world. The citizens of Colombia, mainly in the southern region of the nation, are currently dealing with the problem of landmines planted by the FARC. The FARC had lost a lot of power and influence, so in turn they switched from direct combat to placing landmines to wreak havoc on the Colombian population and army. Since the 1990s, over 10,000 people have been injured or killed by landmines. Jorge is currently in the field with a witness of a landmine explosion.
Thank you, Jackson. I am here with Isabella, a witness of a landmine accident here in southern Colombia. What happened to you?
I was walking one day to this stream with my husband. We were on a romantic walk together, having a great time. Then he went to the stream to get some water when he stepped on a landmine. The next thing I remember is hearing a loud sound and a huge pain in my heart. After all the debris cleared, I realized that my husband was spread all over the place.
I am extremely sorry for your loss. Can you go on with this interview?
See,
Thank you. What actions do people take to avoid being injured by these landmines?
there isn't anything that we citizens can necessarily do against these landmines. We just be very careful with every step that we take. The Army, however, is constantly surveying certain areas for landmines to try and secure our safety. We Colombians have been severely displaced. I myself have moved 3 times just this year trying to get away from threats.
I am very sorry to hear about that. I hope that your situation gets better. Back to you, Jackson.
Gracias, Jorge. In the past couple of years, talk of peace has come about the nation. The current president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, has been trying to implement a 5-point peace plan with the FARC. The plan includes land reform, political participation, drug trafficking, victims' rights and reparations, and disarmament of rebels and implementation of a peace deal. The FARC has only agreed to the first 3 points of the plan as of now, but the future looks bright for Colombia. With the guerrillas disappearing and the drug trade losing influence, Colombia might be able to regain a strong and balanced government. Now to Levi with Ukraine.
In recent news, the conflict in Eastern Europe is still ongoing. The country of Ukraine has been turned into a battleground. It is the rebel-controlled East versus the government-held West. This fighting also has some Russian intervention, as well as some Western nations trying to control it. Some background on this conflict so you can understand it better. Back in 1991, when the USSR was collapsing, Ukraine decided to leave and form their own country, and that is how the modern country of Ukraine was formed. The geography of this country is one of its largest issues. It is located in the middle of the main Western Europe and Russia. This will cause there to be two sides and ethnic groups in the country. The Ukrainian/pro-European side, which is the West, and the heavily influenced eastern side of Ukraine. This will be one of the main roots of the conflict. But fast forwarding all the way to 2010 with the presidential election with pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych as the winner, he then institutes a new policy to abandon closer trade ties with the European Union in 2013. This angers a lot of the Western Ukrainian people because they want to be more European. The protesters start to gather in the capital city of Kiev. In February of 2014, the protests turn violent, with police firing mercilessly into the crowd of protesters. The protesters are advancing through the city and taking buildings. The capital city of Kiev is turned into a battleground. Here is some footage of the fighting in Kiev.
Then, carnage. Police shooting as protesters ran up the hill towards them. Having abandoned their positions, they seemed to be firing at will. We watched as protesters advanced straight into the line of fire. A few had weapons, but most were armed only with makeshift shields. They were gunned down mercilessly. When the protesters charged up the hill, the police opened fire with automatic rifles, and now we're seeing many protesters coming back badly injured.
Amidst all the chaos, Yanukovych abandons Ukraine and the Westerners take control. With fear of radical policy changes, Russia annexes the large southern peninsula of Crimea. The people do not resist because most of them identify themselves as ethnic Russians. The fighting now shifts over to the eastern part of Ukraine, with the rebels taking government buildings and working to take as much land as they can from their old government. Different treaties are enacted but have little effect because they are broken just a few days after they are made. The rebels reach a high point when they take the airport in Donetsk, which is in the eastern part of Ukraine. The airport is in very bad shape after it is taken. It would not function as a proper airport. Now today, this conflict has been paused with a treaty, but like all the ones in the past, it will most likely not last. An interview with Ukraine's president, Petro Poroshenko, expresses the threat of a Russian war.
Their offensive is coming from
I'm not
that side.
fear anything.
But you believe that they're preparing
I
an
believe
offensive?
that they're prepared for the offensive, and I think that we should be ready for that. And I think that, but we do not give them any tiny chance for provocation. That would be totally their responsibility. We will keep all the Minsk obligation, including the ceasefire, including withdrawal the heavy artillery and weapons.
So are you
And
going to
we
get the support you want from the EU, from Britain, to fight that? The military support?
Ukraine is a very well-developed country who produce their own lethal weapons. And but at the same time, Russia's supply to their troops and to their supported or their back terrorist troops, state-of-art, most modern, lethal weapons.
So that's all for the Ukraine news. Now time for David with Syria.
Nice. In the United States in recent months, riots and social unrest have created great divides and widespread destruction. In Western nations, this behavior is often seen as outlandish or out of the cultural norm. But in Syria, this type of behavior is a constant. For the past 4 years, brutal civil war has ravaged the nation, leaving cities in total ruins and turning brother against brother. In March of 2011, a series of protests and riots known as the Arab Spring were spreading across the Middle East and North Africa. These protests symbolized an awakening and were inspired by dreams of prosperity and democracy, and the overthrow of authoritarian dictators whose oppressive rule had been present for decades. In Syria, this meant the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, a man who, like his father Hafez, was infamous for practices that were ill-favored by the Syrian populace. Some of these practices involved the utilization of military and civilian life, harsh suppression of political dissent, and the prohibition of foreign journalists from entering the nation. Soon the Syrian people, inspired by the wave of protests in neighboring nations, seized an opportunity. They took to the streets in droves and peaceably resisted. However, the resistance quickly turned to violence, as a group of children were promptly arrested for anti-government graffiti. In the city of Daraa, a group of protesters speaking out against the arrest were fired upon by government forces. Rebel groups consolidated and peace talks initiated by the UN and Arab League failed. The opposition was soon acknowledged and supported by other nations, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and even nations like the United States. The regime drew international support also from nations including Russia and Iran. Radical Islamists and jihadists from neighboring nations also took advantage of the uprisings to take advantage of the conflict to pursue their own agendas. Religious tension has also been present in the conflict, as the majority of the opposition and jihadists practice the Sunni faith, while the regime is primarily made up of the Alawite Shiite denomination. As the violence and tension rose, the uprising descended into total civil war. Groups supporting the opposition include the Free Syrian Army, or FSA, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamic Front, and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The FSA is the oldest opposition group and is not fueled by religious extremism. This group is supported by Western and other world powers with the overall goal to overthrow Assad for the betterment of Syria. Unfortunately, this group is outnumbered by extremists who seek to use the war for their own gains. Jabhat al-Nusra works to increase al-Qaeda's power in the region and also wishes to establish an Islamic caliphate or nation in the process. The same can be said for the Islamic Front group, as well as the infamous Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, whose members have wreaked unimaginable havoc in the conflict. The regime draws support from the Syrian Armed Forces, the Al-Quds Force, the National Defense Forces, and even a terrorist group known as Hezbollah. The Syrian Armed Forces, as well as the National Defense Militias, work together to preserve the regime alongside the Al-Quds Force, a detachment of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard that protects Iranian interests in the region. The terrorist group known as Hezbollah is also being paid by Assad to fight alongside these powers. The conflict has continued into the present day, and not much has changed since its beginning in early 2011. Since its conception, more than 200,000 lives have been lost, tens of thousands being children. Chemical strikes have also been carried out by the government against civilians, including attacks involving chlorine and ammonia, as well as the horrific sarin gas. Perhaps the most pressing issue, however, is the plight of refugees. An estimated 9 million Syrians, half of the nation's pre-war population, have been displaced from their homes or fled the country altogether, making Syrians the largest refugee group in the world. To make matters worse, the infamous ISIS terrorist organization has become the primary focus of the conflict in its present state, performing mass executions and committing countless other atrocities against combatants and civilians alike. To shed more light on the situation, I briefly interviewed Anas Abadi, author of the book In the Midst of the Chaos, the story of a Syrian refugee who fled to the US. Let's watch. How difficult was it to not just survive the war, but to escape it as well?
Every day is a challenge. Over there, you simply do not know what will happen next, be that a bombing raid or an ambush on the road. Everything is hostile, and everything is trying to kill you.
In the book, you talk about the loss of your wife and family in a rebel attack. Do you have any idea where they are now?
It's difficult to say. They could be anywhere. I've learned to cope with the sadness and loneliness, but the thought of them being alone and suffering is the worst. For all I know, they could very well be dead.
Your suffering is obviously understandable. But in the midst of all this, why did you decide to write this book?
To put on display the extent and seriousness of the suffering and horrors present in Syria. Those in the West should know what is happening.
Do you see any end to this conflict in the near future?
No, I do not. Not for many years.
In the Midst of the Chaos is on sale now. It's a great read. I encourage you to read it. Now on to Benjamin Shepard with Iran.
Thank you, David. I'm Benjamin Shepard, and I am here with Cheney Donovan. As you most likely know, Iran and Israel are currently at a large dispute over nuclear weapons that has dragged other nations into the conflict. Iran has been building a nuclear program since 1968, and in 1970, they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That made their nuclear program subject to verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency.
You know, that's interesting, because the two nations have not always been at odds. In the past, they even had times when they banded together to accomplish a common goal. They once joined forces, so to speak, to keep Pan-Arabism down in the Middle East.
That's right, but that was a short-lived period of tranquility. The relations between the two nations have been declining since 1951. This was a year that the Iranian government ordered their representative to leave the nation of Israel, and this caused some unrest.
Yes, and Israel even confronted Iran about this.
Iran's explanation to this was that they had budget cuts and cannot afford to have a representative be staying in Israel. This was found to be a false excuse, however, because Iranian officials told other Arab states that they would withdraw from Israel if they got assistance in the oil dispute that it was in at that time. Another reason for this action is that Iran was trying to improve some of its other foreign affairs. A British official who is staying in Tehran, the capital of Iran, said, "For what it is worth, we think that this sudden move by the Persians was mainly dictated to their anxiety to please the Iraqis in the hope of inducing them to prevent British troops and warships from using Iraqi territory and territorial waters." This quote shows that the reasoning for withdrawing was not out of hatred for Israel, but for completely separate benefit of Iran, and that even though their relations were deteriorating, there was no major conflict between the two nations yet. Today, the major conflict between the two nations is because Iran is trying to create a nuclear program and obtain powerful weapons, and Israel does not agree with it, as they see it as a threat to their security. One major thing they consider a threat is a shipment of S-300 missiles from Russia to Iran. Here's more information on this specific trade.
Vladimir Putin has ordered to lift the ban on the delivery of the S-300 missile systems to Iran. Putin's order will become effective upon his signature. Reports say the delivery of the S-300 systems could be completed in a few months to a year, depending on the model. Israel and the United States were quick to criticize Russia over the decision. Tel Aviv says it will put Israel in danger. Iran had purchased a sophisticated defense mechanism at $800 million in 2007, but Russia failed to deliver it until 2010, when the UN Security Council banned selling arms to Iran. Now the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, says that the S-300 is a defense system and does not fall within the sanctions on sales of arms to Iran. Iran has reacted positively to Russia's decision to deliver S-300 defense missile systems. Defense Minister Brigadier General Hossein Dehghan says the decision is the manifestation of the determination by Iran and Russia to promote mutual ties in all areas. General Dehghan says cooperation between the two countries will help strengthen regional stability. Also, Iran's security chief, Ali Shamkhani, says Russia's decision to deliver S-300 missile system is the result of Iran's policies that he says have contributed to regional stability. Shamkhani says the decision was also the result of the goodwill of the Russian President Vladimir Putin towards Iran.
As shown in this clip, there are large amounts of weapons being shipped to Iran. Iran's excuse for this is that they are using them as purely defensive mechanisms, saying that these weapons in the hands of the Iranian government would create stability within the region. Israel, however, does not agree with this. This is seen as a threat to Israel's security. At the same time, Iran is pursuing a nuclear deal with the United States, even though the U.S. Security Council banned selling arms to Iran. President Obama has been discussing terms for a deal for months now, and he thinks that this would make Iran a powerful influence in the region of the world. A nuclear deal with the United States would give Iran just what they have been pursuing for nearly half a century, and what Israel has been trying to prevent for just as long. Although, even as much as Israel is trying to resist and prevent Iran from becoming too powerful, they are becoming a major influence due to the large number of Shia Muslims in the military and population of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Experts think that Iran will not likely be able to control all of what they could potentially gain, but they will still be a major force in terrorism, war, and chaos, especially if they obtain nuclear weapons. This is precisely what the Israelis have been trying to prevent. This conflict needs a group of powerful countries to step in and stop it before a war breaks out in the Middle East and potentially spreads to the rest of the world.
Yes, this is exactly what we need. We also need a commercial break. We'll be back right after this message.
Cyberbullying is a major problem these days. Everyone is affected by it, even world leaders. The leader of Iran tweeted 9 ways to destroy Israel, or some would say he subtweeted at Benjamin Netanyahu, and also all of the people of Israel. This young man here was only cyberbullied by one person, who was just an average citizen. Imagine if you and the rest of your country was being cyberbullied by a powerful leader of the world. Think before you tweet, guys, so you can stop this from happening from an entire nation.
Hello, I'm Cheney Donovan, and tonight we take an inside look on the war in Afghanistan. As many people know, the war in Afghanistan is the longest that the United States has ever seen. We first went into the country after the attacks on the Twin Towers and bombing raids started in December of late 2001. Soon after the bombing started, the military put boots on the ground in the country. But to understand the war in Afghanistan, we first need to understand who the Taliban are and what they want. The Taliban is a group of fighters who are working to gain control in Afghanistan by any means possible. The group was first formed by Mujahideen fighters when the Soviets were in control of the country. Their goal was to drive the Soviets from the country, and once they were successful with this, the country went into chaos as they had no form of government. Many different groups were formed during this time, but the Taliban emerged the most powerful with promises to the people of economic stability. Once the group was in power, they put in place what is known as Sharia law. This law was very harsh to women and put them way under men in society. The group also banned films and television in the country. The Taliban was in charge of the country from 1996 to 2001. Once the Taliban was kicked out of power, a group of elders was set up to choose a new president for the country. The group met in Germany, and after a couple of days of discussion, the group had made a decision. The elders decided that Hamid Karzai would run the country, and in late 2004, Karzai took office in the country. Karzai held office for almost a full decade, as he just left office in late 2014. Although the Taliban were out of power in 2001, they still had a strong grip on some territory in the country and are still trying to take back the land. Damn it. Although the Taliban were out of the... I'm so good at this. Great. Okay. Although the Taliban were out of power in 2001, they still had a strong grip on some territory in the country and are still trying to take back the land that they had lost. Recently, I had the pleasure of visiting an army base in Afghanistan and securing an interview with General Matthews of the United States Army.
It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, General. I know you have a very busy schedule and appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
How long have you been in the service, General?
I have been in for 25 years, and I have been over here for 13 of those 25.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, General, we know that although the Taliban is no longer in control, they're still working for control and still have control over some areas.
That's right, Cheney. We were able to get the group out of power when we came into the country, but they still have some strongholds on key points. Most recently, they have secured a vital checkpoint going into the capital city of Kabul.
Can you not put a stop to this group?
We are doing all that we can at the moment, but as you might know, our combat mission is now over, and we are just here as a security force, so we cannot do as much as we would like at this time. We were able to do much more when we had a combat mission, but that also meant putting many more lives at risk. We are losing far less men with our new mission. This year, we have only lost 3 soldiers. 4 years ago, at this time, we had lost 100 soldiers.
Well, that certainly sounds like a good thing, General. I know you have some very important work to get to, so I won't hold you any longer. I very much appreciate you taking time out of your day to do this interview.
It's no problem. Thank you very much for having me, Cheney.
That was my interview with General Matthews. Hopefully the military can resolve this conflict soon and get the troops back home. Thank you all for watching tonight's segment of Cultural Bazooka News. Tune in next week for our segment on illegal immigrants. I'm Cheney Donovan, CBN.